It's a toxic cocktail of civil war, famine, and a collapsing healthcare system that's ravaging the people of Sudan for more than a year now. The United Nations says 14,000 people have died during fighting between the country's military and paramilitary groups since April of last year. Another 33,000 wounded and 10 million people displaced. My next guest is an advocate for the Sudanese people and just testified before the UN Security Council this morning. Here's a bit of what she said.
Despite the urgent need, there is currently no entity that has a protection of civilians mandate in Sudan, beyond the de facto authorities that have again proven themselves unable and unwilling to do so. This leaves the vast majority of Sudanese people entirely exposed during the ongoing conflict and vulnerable to atrocity committed by the RSF, the SAF, and allied militias.
Joining me now, Khaloud Khair, a Sudanese political analyst and founding director of the Sudanese think tank Confluence Advisory. Great to see you, Khaloud, and I am curious to know if you received any reaction from the Security Council after you did make your speech, and if not, what do you hope it takes away from what you had to say today?
I hope the Security Council really starts to reckon with the urgency of a protection of civilians mission in Sudan. There has been a Security Council resolution in the past few months that called for the UN to do much more to put forward protection options, including around what a mission could look like. So far, we've seen very little traction on that, but the needs continue to grow. As your report said, it's 11 million people displaced. Half the country is facing food insecurity, and at least half the country requires humanitarian assistance. So we have a famine that's been declared in the past few days, and that's a very minimal part of what we know to be the famine-like conditions experienced in other parts of the country. The response just has not been fast enough and has not been sufficient enough.
Well, response by advocates like you has been tremendous, especially fellow female Sudanese activists. You've been able to achieve so much within this conflict. Talk to me more about how there's just this group of powerful women like yourselves and fellow human rights defenders have been able to really be heard within this conflict.
I mean, I think there's still a long way to go before enough Sudanese women and enough Sudanese people are heard. As you know, Sudan does not rank very highly in terms of world priorities right now. But in terms of Sudanese women, we understand very clearly that this is a war that is being fought on the bodies of women and girls. We see reports of conflict-related sexual violence. We see all types of gender-based violence across the country, particularly in parts of Darfur, but also parts of the country that had never seen war up until now. And with that understanding means that we cannot be complacent. And even though we're not getting the requisite response from international institutions, from the various countries that have a stake in what's going on in Sudan, from the various countries that are leading mediations on Sudan, we're still hoping that with enough pushing, we're able to move the needle at least enough to make sure we inculcate some kind of protection mechanisms into the country as soon as possible.
What more can the international community do to push the needle?
First things first, in terms of famine, there needs to be a very quick recognition that including the Sudanese armed forces in the famine classification mechanism, the IPC, means that you're not going to get announcements of famine quickly enough, and in some cases not at all. So the UN needs to very quickly come up with independent mechanisms of verifying data on famine so that famine declarations can be made across the country. That should trigger resources in order to be able to meet the famine conditions across the country. And in terms of the arms embargo, we're seeing that the UN's own arms embargo is not being sufficiently respected by member states. That arms embargo, which currently only covers Darfur, needs to include the rest of the country because it is exactly the flow of arms that we're seeing coming into the country that are precipitating the increase in conflict-related sexual violence on the bodies of women and girls across the country. There's also, several mediation tracks that are taking place, specifically to guarantee a ceasefire. Now, it's very clear that a ceasefire alone will not save lives, and the protection mechanisms need to have a separate diplomatic track to be able to be established. But the ceasefire talks as well need to ensure that they have adequate, full and equal and safe participation of women, which we haven't seen thus far at all.
Well, we know how important a ceasefire is, but you make the point. It's the leadership and how things will move forward once that ceasefire is in place, which I know you've been advocating for, and your voice is so strong, and your work is admirable. Khaloud Khair, thank you so much for being with me.